We are joined by Brian Shanahan, CEO and founder of INFORMITA and termscheck.com, and we'll be examining the impact of procurement on working capital management. The basics never change, and it's not just about automation. What are the main trends, Brian, before we look at these two aspects of procurement and working capital management?
Well, firstly, thanks, Jack, for having us on today. But in terms of main trends, I mean, we see lots of stuff in the press about, blockchain, artificial intelligence, various forms of automation, cloud software, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all those things are happening, but they tend to only impact the people who are operating at the very, very top level. For the vast majority of people, they're still dealing with the basics. And by the basics, I mean the basics of how do I buy products at the right price, with the right payment term, with the right quality, and so on. And if we take it right to the other extreme, there's still many organizations out there, particularly small and medium-sized organizations, who don't have procurement functions at all, and can be quite unsophisticated in the way they deal with this. But equally, there's some very large organizations who you might be surprised at how unsophisticated they can be sometimes.
Within that, what is the main trend in procurement?
I would say specifically, the properly organized procurement departments. More and more they're getting into, big data, automation, because anyone in procurement will tell you that without quality information, you can't really do your job properly. But I think the other thing that's happening is that increasingly there's pressure from the working capital side. So one of the things that we've seen in the numbers now for many years is that days payable outstanding internationally is a particular measure that seems to keep on getting longer and longer and longer, particularly for the very largest corporates.
And that is in a way a bit depressing, but it's the reality. Automation doesn't solve everything.
True, but it should be said that DPO is not just getting longer because we're negotiating longer payment terms. It's also because of things like supply chain finance and things like that as well.
Looking at these two aspects of the impact of procurement on working capital, you picked out these issues around payables. Can you explain?
Firstly, there's the impact that procurement have on accounts payable. So if the terms are longer, then you'd expect the accounts payable balance to be higher. But very often I kind of deal with finance people who say, oh, my payment terms are X. Why are they like that? Well, it's because somebody in the organization, probably in the procurement department, organized a contract with that particular payment term. Now, the question always is, you'll have some organizations that are very sensitive to working capital, some are not so. So those ones that are will want longer payment terms, the longer the better, sometimes to ridiculous extents. Then there's always a trade-off between how long is that payment term going to be versus what's the price that I'm going to pay for the product, or maybe I'm going to get a discount or a rebate or something like that. Now, there's always a trade-off between those two things, and different organizations will decide those things differently. But the key here often is that you go to organizations where there actually is no formal policy. So when you look after the fact to say, well, why does my payment term landscape look like this? Why do I have all these discounts? People will say things like, well, it's always been like that, or that's just the way it is, or various statements like that. No one has actually put some forethought into this to say, how do we actually want it to look over a period of time?
The other issue, and I see it again and again, is that Treasury and Finance quite often are not in control. How do you manage that, and how do you manage it when there isn't actually any procurement function at all?
Well, I'd say two things on that statement, Jack. Firstly, even when there is a proper procurement function, many finance and treasury people kind of back off from this subject because they feel they don't necessarily understand it enough. And as a result of that, there then becomes a lack of interplay between the various official functions. So you get a lack of communication where it's not that procurement are doing bad things, but they're doing things potentially without the knowledge of, well, what's the general business strategy in terms of the financial end of what should we be trying to achieve? That's part one. Part two is where you have the unofficial procurement function, I call it. Now, that can be as simple as the CEO's PA ordering stationery from whoever their favorite person is, rather than going with the procurement deal that's been organized. Or it could be in another company, as you said, maybe there is no formal procurement function, or it's very fractured, or it's all done at say, at a plant level with very little coordination. But the point is that whether that person has a procurement title or doesn't have a procurement title, they are still making these determinations about payment terms, payment frequencies, discounts, are there deposits being paid, and so on and so forth. Whether they do that in the front of their brain or the back of their brain, it's still happening.
And so what's the lesson from this in terms of who should be in charge?
There's many people potentially involved in the whole process, all the way from initially sourcing the product to ending up paying for the thing. What's essential is not so much who's in charge, is that everyone who's part of the chain knows what their role is, they understand what the policy is, and when they do make trade-offs, they understand the parameters that they're allowed to make those trade-offs within, which will be different from one organization to another.
Absolutely. And the same applies to inventory, doesn't it?
It very much does. I remember speaking to a friend of mine many years ago who was of the strong belief that procurement were the key people to drive inventory. And the reasoning behind his statement was that procurement are the people who source the product, they're the people who order the product. Yeah, so they determine how much of the product is being ordered, from who, what the frequency of supply is, what's the supply method. So, for instance, it might be a daily JIT delivery, it might be consignment stock, and it might be full truckloads from China or something like that. There's many variants in terms of what can happen within that sphere. The key thing is that the person in procurement very often will be the person who's making that decision. Now, we should make a slight distinction here, because there might be some supply chain people go, no, that's not procurement's job, that's a supply chain job. But very often there's a little bit of crossover between what the two functions actually do or don't do. But the key thing is, whoever is pushing that order out, they are, again, either consciously or unconsciously making these decisions of how these things are done. And the way that they make those decisions and trade-offs will affect, how much raw material do we have? How do we use that? Exactly what the lead times are from suppliers and so on. So we order on a weekly basis, a daily basis, something different. And the other thing which has become a big subject in the last few years is around supply chain risk. This happened a few years ago with the earthquake in Japan, that suddenly all the car makers in North America were short of parts, because many of the factories that make these parts are actually in central and northern Japan. There's an unexpected event that can have a knock-on effect. So there's many decisions being made here, and they will have an impact on how much or how little inventory you have.
Clearly, procurement and the level of inventory and the types of inventory that you hold are strategic decisions. What is the impact of having too much or too little inventory?
Well, the easy one is if you have too little inventory. If you have too little inventory, then there's a possibility that you're going to lose out on customer sales simply because you don't have the product to supply. The more usual problem is you have too much inventory. It's great to have it on the shelf, just in case that customer does want it. But it does create a strategic problem, because, inventory is a cash invested asset. So therefore, the more I have of inventory, the less cash I have for whatever strategic purpose the organization may have, which could be paying down debt. It could be acquisitions. It could be all sorts of different things. The less cash you have on hand, the less choices you have about how you're going to move forward on a strategic basis.
Again, that's just another example of how strategic procurement is and its impact on working capital.
Absolutely, but unfortunately, there's still a strong body of procurement opinion and non-procurement opinion who believe that procurement is just about getting things at the cheapest price, and that's a very narrow. Well, we all want things to be got at the best value possible, but simply going for the cheapest price is not always a good idea. And quite frankly, in the past year, that's exactly what we saw with the Grenfell disaster.
The implications of short-term thinking is profound.
Potentially fatal.
And sadly, yes. My take from this web chat is that procurement shouldn't be just left to the procurement department and to sales, that finance and treasury need to have input. What is your overall take on what's going on here?
My experience of this is not to say procurement good, procurement bad, or finance or treasury good, finance and treasury bad. The essential thing is that everybody's operating as a team to the same conscious strategy, yeah, and that means that more people will make more decisions which are in line with that strategy, whatever the company has decided. And without that, what you'll have is lots of people going solo, not because they're trying to be heroes, it's because they're trying to do their best, and that's what they're going to try to do, even if it's the wrong thing.
Fascinating, Brian, as always. Thank you very much.
Thank you.